It was 3:47 in the morning when Margaret Finch woke to the smell of burning silk. She ran to her daughter's room first, her heart already breaking. Catherine was gone. The window was open. And when Margaret rushed outside onto the lawn, she found her youngest standing in the middle of the grass, illuminated by flames, holding an empty gasoline can. The dress was burning. Not just any dress. The Finch family wedding dress, the one that had clothed 6 generations of brides, altered and adjusted and carefully preserved in a cedar chest for 150 years. The dress that Catherine was supposed to wear in 17 days. The dress that every Finch daughter wore on the most important day of her life. The dress that was now turning to ash. Margaret tried to run toward it, to save what could be saved. But Catherine moved with surprising force for a girl of 22. She blocked her mother's path. Her face was hollow. Her eyes were not the eyes of her daughter. "Don't," Catherine said. Her voice was steady. Almost calm. "Don't touch what's left." The dress burned for another hour. The silk turned black. The lace dissolved into nothing. The beading and pearls fell like tears onto the scorched earth. And Catherine stood watching until there was nothing left but ash and the ghost of something that had been there. When the fire burned down, she finally looked at her mother. "I'm sorry," she said. "But it had to be destroyed." The Finch family had always been particular about their weddings. They came from old money, the kind that doesn't advertise itself. The kind that lives in carefully maintained Victorian homes on tree-lined streets, that keeps to itself, that understands the weight of tradition the way other people understand breathing. The Finches had lived in the same town for 5 generations. They had married well. They had kept their daughters close. And they had kept the dress even closer. It was cream silk, hand-stitched, with pearl beading across the bodice and French lace at the sleeves. It had a long train and a veil that had yellowed slightly but never been replaced. The dress was beautiful in the way that old things are beautiful, not perfect, but consecrated by time. Every Finch bride wore it. Great-great-grandmother Margaret had worn it in 1873. Great-grandmother Eleanor had worn it in 1902. Grandmother Ruth had worn it in 1930. Catherine's mother, Patricia, had worn it in 1985. And they had never questioned it. The dress was simply part of being a Finch woman. You grew up knowing that someday you would wear it. Your mother would help you into it, adjusting the waist, letting out the hem, tightening the bodice. And then you would walk down the aisle, and you would be a Finch bride. Hundreds of townspeople would see you in that dress and understand that you belonged to something old and unbroken. Until Catherine burned it. The Finch family became the subject of whispers after that night. People who had attended generations of Finch weddings suddenly began questioning things they had never questioned before. Why did they never talk about the dress? Why did the tradition continue without explanation? And most disturbingly, why did no one seem surprised when Catherine claimed she couldn't wear it? Her mother was shocked. Her grandmother was appalled. But the older women in the family, great-aunts and elderly cousins, they looked at each other with a kind of knowing sadness. As if they had been waiting for someone to finally do what they had never found the courage to do. Catherine had been engaged for 8 months. His name was David. He was handsome and kind and wealthy and everything that a Finch girl was supposed to want. The engagement was announced in the local paper. The wedding was scheduled for June. The church was booked. The reception hall was reserved. And Catherine seemed happy, or at least, the version of happy that she was supposed to be. Then, 6 weeks before the wedding, she tried on the dress. Her mother said it was a private moment. Just the two of them in Catherine's bedroom, the afternoon light coming through the windows, the dress unfolded from its tissue paper wrapping. Patricia had worn it at her own wedding 37 years before. It had been her mother's before that. It was time for Catherine to understand what it meant to be a Finch bride. Catherine put it on. No one else was there to see what happened in those moments. Only Catherine could testify to what she experienced. But what is certain is that when she came downstairs, something had changed. She was pale. She was trembling. She asked her mother to remove the dress, and her voice was not a request, it was a command. That night, she had the first nightmare. She described it to her mother in fragments, the next morning. She was wearing the dress, but she was not at her own wedding. She was somewhere else. Somewhere dark. And there was something else wearing the dress with her, something that was inside the fabric, moving with it, breathing with it. She could feel it against her skin. She could feel it thinking. Her mother dismissed it as pre-wedding jitters. Stress. Cold feet. Every bride had doubts. But Catherine didn't have doubts. Catherine had fear. She began having the nightmares every night. She stopped eating. She stopped leaving the house. She would lie in bed for hours, staring at nothing, and when her mother asked what was wrong, she would only say, "The dress is still here. I can feel it. Even when I'm not touching it, I can feel it waiting." Her fiancé called multiple times. Her mother assured him it was temporary. The wedding would happen. Of course the wedding would happen. This was the Finch family. The dress would be worn. But Catherine knew something her family didn't want to understand. She knew that something was wrong with the dress in a way that went beyond the fabric and thread. After Catherine burned the dress, historians and family genealogists began to reconstruct what should have been obvious all along. The pattern was there. It had always been there. It was just so deeply woven into the texture of the family that no one had thought to question it. Every Finch bride who wore the dress reported something. The accounts varied, but the fundamental elements remained consistent. Some spoke of a presence they felt while wearing it. A sensation of being occupied. A feeling that the dress had a will of its own, separate from their own desires. Some reported physical marks on their bodies after wearing the dress, bruises that appeared in no logical pattern, marks that looked like fingers gripping their ribs, handprints that couldn't be explained. Some spoke of missing time on their wedding nights. They would put on the dress for the ceremony, and the next clear memory they had was the following morning. Hours had passed. But there was no memory of the reception, no memory of the first dance, no memory of what happened in the marriage bed. And some, a significant number, actually, said that their marriages changed after wearing the dress. Husbands who had been loving became cold. Wives who had been confident became submissive. Relationships that had seemed perfect suddenly fractured in ways that couldn't be explained or repaired. One bride, Martha Finch, married in 1958, had told her daughter in confidence, "When I wore that dress, I became someone else. I agreed to things I never would have agreed to. I said yes to things that hurt me. And I couldn't stop myself. It was like the dress was speaking through me, using my mouth to make promises I didn't want to make." Martha's marriage lasted 32 years. Her husband was abusive. She stayed because she believed she had promised to stay. When her daughter asked why she hadn't simply left, Martha had said something that chilled her, "I did try to leave. Twice. But the moment I considered it, I would feel the dress, even though I wasn't wearing it anymore, pulling at me. Reminding me of the promises I'd made. And I couldn't break them." Another bride, Helen Finch, married in 1965, had become pregnant within weeks of wearing the dress. The child, a daughter, was born with a red birthmark shaped like a handprint on her shoulder. Helen would never speak about the pregnancy. When her daughter asked about it years later, Helen had simply said, "The dress chose. That's all you need to know." The pattern extended further back than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Great-grandmother Eleanor, who married in 1902, had spent the last 40 years of her life in a psychiatric hospital. Her diagnosis was listed as severe hysteria of unknown origin. But her medical records contained entries from nurses who had visited her, describing her endless repetition of a single phrase, "It wore me. It didn't fit me. It wore me." No one had ever asked what she meant. The dress had not always belonged to the Finch family. This was the discovery that changed everything. A genealogist named Dr. Margaret Owens was researching the family history when she found a letter, dated 1873, in a box of old papers. The letter was from a woman named Constance Finch to her sister. It read, in part, "I have done something I cannot undo. A woman came to the house. I do not know how she knew me or how she found us. She carried a dress and she said it was mine to have. She said that if I kept it and passed it to my daughters, and they passed it to theirs, that our family would be blessed with beautiful marriages and prosperous unions. I was young and foolish. I took the dress. Only later did I understand that the woman had not asked for payment, she had already been paid. The dress itself was the payment." The letter ended there. Constance Finch never explained what she meant by "the woman had already been paid." Further research revealed that the dress had belonged, before 1873, to a woman named Miriam Vale. Miriam Vale had been a seamstress of some renown in her time. She had lived alone, never married, and had died in 1873, the exact year that Constance Finch received the dress. Miriam's death was listed in the local records as death of unknown cause. Her house had been empty when her body was discovered. But a neighbor's account, written decades later and found in a historical society archive, contained a single sentence that seemed to shimmer with meaning. The seamstress's dress was missing when they found her. She had always said it was the most important thing she'd ever made. It was the only thing that mattered. What Miriam Vale had stitched into that dress was never found in historical records. But something had been there. Some previous owner of the dress had left accounts, fragments, really, of feeling something in the hem. A weight. A presence. Something that hadn't been made of thread or fabric. One account, from the 1920s, described a young woman tearing open the hem of the dress, searching for whatever was inside. She had found nothing. But her hands had been cut and bleeding, as if she'd encountered something sharp. Something that didn't want to be found. The dress had survived intact. The mystery had survived with it. And the Finch family had continued, generation after generation, wearing a dress that contained something it couldn't see. After Catherine burned the dress, the older Finch women began to speak. They had been silent for so long that their voices sounded strange, even to themselves. But with the dress destroyed, or so they thought, they found the courage to say the things they had kept hidden. Catherine's great-aunt Dorothy, who was 91 and living in a nursing home, told her granddaughter, "When I wore it, I could feel something moving inside the seams. It wasn't aggressive, exactly. It was more like it was learning me. Learning my body. Learning what it felt like to be me. And when the dress came off, I felt like something had been taken out of me that I couldn't get back." Catherine's grandmother, Ruth, who had worn the dress in 1930, said, "My wedding night, I heard whispering. I thought it was my husband, but he was asleep. The whispering was coming from the dress, which was hanging on the chair beside the bed. It was saying words in a language I didn't recognize. I was terrified. In the morning, I pretended nothing had happened. But I never wore the dress again, not even for photographs." Catherine's mother, Patricia, admitted, "I wore it because I had to. Because it was expected. But while I was wearing it, I felt like I was disappearing. Like the dress was becoming more real than I was. My voice sounded different. My thoughts felt different. And when my husband looked at me, it was like he was looking at something that wasn't entirely me." The most chilling account came from an elderly cousin named Elizabeth, who had worn the dress in 1947. "Something was speaking through me during the ceremony. I could hear myself saying the vows, but they weren't my words. And after the ceremony, I had no memory of the reception. My husband said I had danced all night. But I hadn't danced in years. I had no memory of it. When I came to, that's the word I'll use, came to, I was in my marriage bed, and my body ached in ways I couldn't explain, and my husband looked at me like I was a stranger he'd paid to be there." These women had carried the secret for decades. They had raised daughters, kept homes, lived lives that appeared normal from the outside. But inside, they had been shaped by something that had occupied their bodies on the most important day of their lives. And they had said nothing. Because in their time, you did not question tradition. You did not speak of things that couldn't be explained. You certainly did not accuse your family's most sacred object of being something other than what it was supposed to be. Eleanor Finch was married on a cold day in November, 1952. The ceremony was beautiful. The reception was lavish. The dress was as perfect as it had always been. Eleanor's husband was a respectable man, a lawyer with good prospects and a solid family. The union was considered ideal. 9 months later, Eleanor had a daughter. The child was born healthy, but with something unusual, a birthmark on her shoulder blade, red and distinct, shaped precisely like a human handprint. The midwife had never seen anything like it. Eleanor would say nothing about it, except once, to her own mother, she wasn't born. She was given. The dress gave her. That's what happened. Eleanor's mental state began to deteriorate within months of her daughter's birth. She would wake in the middle of the night, screaming. She would stand at windows for hours, staring at nothing. She would speak to people who weren't there. Her husband hired nurses. He called specialists. Nothing helped. By the time Eleanor was 30, she had been institutionalized. Her diagnosis was severe hysteria with delusional ideation. She spent 40 years in a psychiatric hospital, and every day of those 40 years, she repeated the same phrase over and over: "It wore me. It didn't fit me. It wore me." Psychiatric nurses who worked with Eleanor documented that she seemed to be responding to something no one else could perceive. She would gesture at empty air. She would flinch at nothing. She would sometimes seem to be in conversation with something invisible. One nurse's note, dated 1968, read, "Patient claims she can still feel the dress. She says it's looking for her daughter. She says it's waiting for the next bride. Patient is inconsolable." Eleanor died in the psychiatric hospital at age 78. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. But the night she died, a nurse reported that Eleanor had been smiling, genuinely, peacefully smiling, for the first time in decades. "It's done with me," Eleanor had whispered, just before she died. "Maybe now it will leave her alone." Her daughter lived to be 74. The birthmark shaped like a handprint never faded. And she never married. Catherine Finch's diary was discovered in a storage box 3 months after she burned the dress. The entries were methodical, almost scientific. Catherine had become obsessed with understanding what the dress was. She had documented every sensation, every nightmare, every fragment of information she could gather from her female relatives. And then she had done something no other Finch woman had done: she had physically examined the dress. The entries became more frantic as she described her investigation. She had felt something in the hem, a weight, a thickness that didn't match the rest of the fabric. She had tried to open the seam with scissors. The scissors had broken. She had used a knife. The knife had bent at an impossible angle, as if it had struck something harder than anything a knife could cut. One entry, dated 3 weeks before she burned the dress, read, "Whatever is in the hem is not made of thread. It's not made of any material I recognize. When I touch it through the fabric, I feel it respond. It's aware. It knows I'm trying to find it. And I can feel its anger." Another entry, "I confronted my mother about the dress's history. She would barely speak of it. But I found her old journals in the attic. She knew something was wrong. She'd known since the moment she put it on. But she never told anyone because she was told, by her own mother, that speaking of it would only make it stronger." The final entry, dated the night before she burned the dress, was the most disturbing. "I understand now. The dress isn't cursed. It's inhabited. Something is living in it. Something that was stitched into the hem by Miriam Vale. I believe Miriam Vale made a choice, to pour something of herself into the dress, to make it a vessel for something that could live beyond her death. She gave the dress away knowing it would be worn, knowing it would be passed down, knowing it would eventually touch dozens of bodies across generations. The dress is feeding on us. It's using us to exist. It's learning how to be human by inhabiting human bodies on the days when we're most vulnerable, most open, most willing to surrender ourselves. And I'm going to burn it. Burn it completely. Destroy the vessel. Kill whatever is living inside it." She had tried. The dress had burned. But Catherine's diary ended with a final note, written in shaking handwriting, dated the morning after the fire. "I saw something in the flames. Just for a moment. A shape. A face. And it looked at me. And I realized, fire doesn't destroy something that has learned how to exist beyond the body. Fire just released it." The Finch family fractured after Catherine burned the dress. Her fiancé, David, waited for a week before finally accepting that the wedding would not happen. He moved away. He eventually married someone else, in a different town, in a white dress that had no history. Catherine never spoke to him again. Catherine's relationship with her family became strained. Her mother, Patricia, never truly forgave her for destroying a 5-generation-old heirloom. Her grandmother was appalled. The extended family whispered about Catherine's instability, her paranoia, her obsession with a dress that was simply a dress. But within 6 months of the dress being destroyed, Catherine's younger sister, Margaret, became engaged. Margaret was 20 years old. She was engaged to a kind man named Thomas. The wedding was planned for the following spring. And Margaret swore, absolutely swore, that she would not wear the family dress. She would wear a new dress, something purchased from a store, something with no history. But as the wedding date approached, something changed in Margaret's mind. She found herself thinking about the dress. Wondering about it. Her mother mentioned, casually, that a seamstress had begun working on restoring some pieces of the dress that had survived the fire. Margaret thought about it constantly. 2 days before her wedding, Margaret went to her mother and said, "I want to wear the dress." Her mother was shocked. "Margaret, after everything." "I know," Margaret said. "But I want to. I need to." The dress had been partially reconstructed. Not all of it. Some pieces had been completely consumed by the flames. But a careful seamstress had managed to preserve enough fabric to create a wearable garment. It was not perfect. It was not complete. But it existed. Margaret wore it down the aisle. And when she did, the family who was watching said something extraordinary happened. For just a moment, the dress seemed to glow. Not with any external light, but from within. As if something was waking up inside it. Margaret married Thomas. She has a daughter now, born 9 months after her wedding, with a strange birthmark on her collarbone that the doctors cannot explain. And the dress, what remained of it after the fire, has been carefully preserved in a new cedar chest. Margaret's mother is already planning the alterations it will need when Margaret's daughter comes of age. The dress survived. It always survives. And the question that haunts those who know the story is the question that Catherine posed in her burned diary. If fire doesn't destroy something that has learned to exist beyond the body, then what happens when it's released? Is it still in the dress? Or is it somewhere else now, moving through the Finch family line, waiting for the next bride, the next moment of vulnerability, the next body it can inhabit and wear like a second skin? And if Catherine is right, if something is learning how to be human by touching the women of her family, then what will it be when it has finally learned enough? The dress remains. The cycle continues. And in the darkness of the Finch family home, there is still the sound of whispers coming from the cedar chest, moving between the folds of silk, waiting for the next daughter, the next bride, the next body to wear.